we try to find the perfect thing to say to make somebody feel good, and sometimes they just need to be heard. So I think it's the willingness, the courage to go first if you want to create this safe space, and then two, being intentional about asking before we're doing all the talking.
Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Don't Change Much podcast. I am your host, Dan Murphy. Today's episode is titled Better Health Starts with a Conversation. So who better to talk to about this subject than a guy who's made a career out of having great conversations? Longtime broadcaster turned keynote speaker, Riaz Meghji. How do you create those safe spaces just for friends? That you might be super tight with someone, but you don't have those real deep conversations. And if you feel like there's something that needs to be talked about, how do you open that door to someone that, guys don't always like to talk about stuff. So how do you create that safe space just in everyday life, a conversation, especially in these days where you don't have that much time for anyone?
2 words come to mind: go first. And if I look at the opportunity to help motivate somebody, go first, find out what motivates them, help them achieve that. If I want to create this safe space one-on-one, I'll go first and share a piece of my humanity and what I've been through to show, hey, I'm gonna trust you, Murph. And you may not react right away and reciprocate, but you'll know that I've put this out here and I'm consistent with that gesture. So they'll know when their time is right. Because some people ask me, they're like, well, how do you break down somebody's emotional barriers? And I laugh at this question. I'm like, how do you break down somebody's barriers? That sounds so aggressive. But how do we just meet people where they're at? And if we go first, give a piece of ourselves, and ultimately ask first and talk second, I think it's so important, because I find people have a pure intent to help others, to serve, to lift them up if they're struggling, especially on the mental health side. But sometimes we try to find the perfect thing to say to make somebody feel good, and sometimes they just need to be heard. So I think it's the willingness, the courage to go first if you want to create this safe space, and then two, being intentional about asking before we're doing all the talking.
We'll circle back around to this type of conversation just as it pertains to grief. I want to get to that in a moment. But first, how did the pandemic shape how you approach these conversations, or how did it shape just your overall career and the changing of messaging with what happened at the start of the pandemic? Or did it?
The pandemic, I feel it created a sense of urgency, because if the message, when I would talk about this idea of loneliness or isolation, and I credit U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy for, I think he's got the most concise description of loneliness. I mean, you have intimate loneliness if you lack partnership, relational if you feel like you don't have a quality support group of friends, collective loneliness if you're missing that affiliation with a group or association, and ultimately isolation, which we all felt firsthand. And then on the flip side, some people will say, well, solitude's a good thing. I mean, if you were at home during the pandemic with the family, having some solitude was really important to recharge. But I felt like the pandemic, looking at these aspects of loneliness and how they impact us, created a sense of urgency with the human connection piece, because we realized that it's not an option, like it's a necessity. The pandemic was almost a reveal of how important social health is. We talk about physical health, mental health, but a lot of people don't talk about social health. And when that was stripped away and then given to you in a 2D experience through a screen where nobody's making eye contact and you're like, what is this? This pandemic, I think, created space to recalibrate. It was like we were all born again with this universal restarting line of uncertainty. It was our universal commonality of what's going to happen here. And instead of just talking about the weather or talking about the pandemic, we went deeper and we started talking about what's really going on in our lives. And I hope this sticks around, that we get past the surface BS and just talk about, hey, what's really happening?
People were lonely and isolated before the pandemic, but obviously the pandemic brought a whole bunch more people into that space, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Is it still a problem for those people that were introduced to it against their will, so to speak, now that the pandemic is apparently behind us and things are back to normal, in quotations?
This is such an important question to ask, because everyone has talked about our physical health with the physical impact of COVID, but the mental health impact, I believe, is about to unfold in the months and years ahead. To truly understand, I mean, one of the most recent studies I was looking at, it came out in May of 2022 by the American Psychological Association, 34 studies were done, 200,000 participants across 4 continents, including North America and Europe, and they found there were many variables, but a 5% increase in overall loneliness. And what that means and how that shows up, it's so personal. I mean, this could elevate stress, anxiety, depression. We know that disrupts sleep. That shows up how, we operate on a day-to-day basis. I think it's a difficult question to answer right now at this point in 2022 as we record this. And depending on when you're listening to this, it's going to be an evolving thing. And I think the important aspect we all need to do is break out of autopilot mode and get intentional with how we check in with one another, how we're asking these questions, how we're listening to each other, and above all, how we're asking for help, which can be a very difficult thing for some people.
Thank you for listening, and a big thanks to everyone who already follows. If you haven't yet, click the follow button on your podcast app so you don't miss upcoming episodes and special guests. Join us every month for a new installment of the Don't Change Much podcast. And if you're new to the show, be sure to check out previous episodes with guests including John Herdman, Kelly Rudy, Trevor Linden, and more. For more helpful tips on improving your mental and physical health, visit menshealthfoundation.ca and don'tchangemuch.ca.